Ukraine has just done something that no one expected. Not a missile strike, not a battlefield push. Something far more calculated and frankly more terrifying for Russia than anything that explodes. Ukrainian officials have now openly, publicly, and on the record told every Russian currently living in Crimea to leave. Not implied it, not hinted at it. Said it out loud, with confidence, with a timeline attached, and with the full weight of what's actually happening on that peninsula backing them up. And if you understand what's been building there over the past several months, that warning doesn't sound dramatic at all. It sounds like the most rational thing anyone has said about this war in a long time. Let's talk about where things actually stand right now, because the situation in Crimea has crossed into territory that I don't think most people in the West are fully grasping yet. The peninsula, home to nearly 2.5 million people, has been effectively severed from its fuel supply. Not reduced. Not rationed down to uncomfortable levels. Gone. The Moscow-installed head of what Russia calls the Republic of Crimea went on camera, officially, and announced a halt to all civilian gasoline sales. Not businesses, not tourists, not individuals. Military personnel only. Everyone else is simply out of luck. And it doesn't matter whether you have a ration card or not, because you cannot ration a resource that no longer exists in any meaningful quantity. Now here's where it gets genuinely interesting, and also where I want you to hit subscribe if you're new here, because this channel has been tracking the slow, strategic strangulation of Crimea for a long time, and what's happening right now is the payoff of a strategy that's been years in the making. If you want to understand how Ukraine actually wins this war, not in theory, not in optimistic projections, but in practice, this is the story to follow. So subscribe now, because this one is going to keep developing fast. Back to Crimea. About a month before that announcement, the same official sources were describing a temporary and limited fuel shortage. Their exact framing was that the cause was known, the solution was being worked on, and everything would return to normal within roughly a month. That was the reassurance. Give it 30 days, be patient, minor inconvenience. And now, 1 month later, that same apparatus is telling people the current situation will remain in place for an undefined period of time. That phrase, undefined period of time, is doing a lot of work. It is the diplomatic language of people who have no idea when or if things will get better, and who are legally and politically unable to simply tell the truth about why. The reason fuel has evaporated from Crimea is not a mystery. Ukraine has been systematically targeting the logistics infrastructure that feeds the peninsula, and they have been extraordinarily effective at it. Fuel depots, supply convoys, the roads and routes that these supplies travel along. The effect is cumulative, and it compounds over time. Every destroyed fuel truck that Russia cannot clear fast enough becomes a landmark on the road into Crimea, a very physical and very real sign to anyone traveling through that something has gone catastrophically wrong. And right now, hundreds of thousands of Russian tourists are seeing exactly that, because Russia has refused to issue any official travel advisory warning people to stay away. Because to do that would be to admit that Crimea is no longer safe. And Crimea being safe, Crimea being Russian, Crimea being untouchable by Ukraine, is central to the entire political mythology that Vladimir Putin has constructed around himself. This is something I want to sit with for a moment, because it matters enormously for understanding why Ukraine is doing what it's doing the way it's doing it. When Putin annexed Crimea in 2014, he did it with stunning speed and minimal visible military force, and the domestic political effect inside Russia was electric. His approval ratings surged. He had taken back something that Russians broadly felt had been wrongfully stripped from them after the Soviet collapse. He had done it cleanly, almost bloodlessly from the Russian perspective, and he had done it in a way that the West was powerless to reverse. That moment became a cornerstone of his legitimacy, the evidence that he was the kind of leader who could expand Russia's power and restore its prestige without paying an unbearable cost. It became the argument for why he should be trusted. Ukraine targeting Crimea is not just a military strategy, it is a direct assault on that mythology. Every burning fuel depot, every grocery store with empty shelves, every rolling blackout in what is supposed to be a Russian vacation paradise is an argument against Putin's competence, against his promise, and against the implicit deal he made with the Russian public. That deal, which went roughly like this: Support the war, send your sons, pay your taxes, and in return you can go on with your normal life. You can take your vacation in Crimea. You will be insulated from the real costs of what we're doing. That deal is now visibly, undeniably falling apart. And the people watching it fall apart are not Western journalists or Ukrainian officials. They are Russian citizens sitting in traffic jams on roads littered with burnt-out trucks, wondering how they're going to get home. Here's a theory I've been sitting with that I think deserves serious consideration. Ukraine may be operating on two simultaneous tracks that appear separate but are actually deeply connected. The first track is the obvious one, the military and logistical campaign to isolate Crimea and degrade Russia's ability to use it as a staging ground and supply hub. The second track is a domestic political operation targeting Russian public opinion, using Crimea specifically because of its psychological significance. The peninsula is not just strategically valuable to Russia, it is emotionally valuable. It is where Russians vacation. It is where Putin's myth lives. And right now, Ukraine is turning it into a symbol of everything the Kremlin promised and failed to deliver. If that theory is correct, then the fuel crisis, the warnings to evacuate, the very public statements from Ukrainian officials, these are not just military communications. They are a coordinated information campaign aimed directly at the Russian citizen who is trying to figure out whether their government is telling the truth. And that campaign is working. We are now seeing Russian war bloggers, people who are ideologically committed to portraying Russia as powerful and Ukraine as doomed, publicly warning that Ukraine could be planning an amphibious invasion of Crimea. Think about what that means for a moment. The people who have the strongest possible incentive to downplay Ukrainian capabilities are the ones raising the alarm. They are not doing that because they want to. They are doing it because the facts on the ground in Crimea have become impossible to spin away. When your own supporters are warning of an imminent Ukrainian invasion of what your government officially calls Russian territory, the propaganda architecture has already collapsed. You're watching the cleanup operation in real time. Now let's talk about the Kerch Strait Bridge, because this is where the strategic picture gets really interesting, and where I want to share something I think is underappreciated. Ukraine has had the demonstrated capability to strike this bridge for quite some time. They have hit it. They have damaged it. But they have never gone all the way. They have never taken it completely out of commission for an extended period. And I want to propose a reason for that, which goes beyond the military calculus that most analysts focus on. Sun Tzu wrote about the concept of leaving your enemy a golden bridge to retreat across. The idea is that a cornered enemy fights with a ferocity that a fleeing enemy does not. If you back someone into a position where they have no escape, they will fight to the death because they have no other option. But if you leave them a way out, most of the time they will take it, and you win without having to pay the full cost of annihilating them. Ukraine leaving the Kerch Bridge partially functional is, in my view, not a limitation of their capabilities. It is a deliberate strategic choice. They are leaving a door open so that Russian civilians, settlers, and ultimately military personnel have a path to leave rather than a reason to fight to the last. And now, with the leader of the Crimean Tatars publicly telling Russian settlers that they should leave now because they may not have another opportunity soon, Ukraine is essentially pointing at that open door and saying, "This is your moment." The timing of that statement is not accidental. You do not make that kind of public declaration unless you believe the conditions are approaching where it becomes critical that civilians have already made their choice. That is not the language of a distant future. That is the language of a window that is currently open and will not remain so. What makes the current moment in Crimea particularly significant is that it is not an isolated event. It is a preview. The same logistical strategy that is strangling Crimea, targeting fuel, targeting supply routes, targeting the infrastructure that modern military operations depend on, is also being applied to the broader Russian front line across occupied Ukrainian territory. Ukraine is hitting the roads and rail connections that Russia depends on to keep its frontline troops supplied. The difference is that on the open steppe of eastern Ukraine, Russia has more options to adapt. There are more roads, more routes, more improvised paths a supply truck can take. In Crimea, which is a peninsula connected to mainland Russia by a single bridge and a limited ferry operation, there is no such flexibility. Crimea is a pressure cooker with no relief valve, and the pressure inside it is increasing every single week. Here is something else worth considering that tends to get overlooked in coverage of this conflict. Russia has continued to pour air defense systems into Crimea throughout this war, even when those systems would arguably be more useful elsewhere. That decision does not make military sense if you evaluate it purely on battlefield terms. But it makes complete sense if you understand that Crimea is a political object as much as a military one. Russia cannot be seen to be withdrawing protection from the peninsula, because withdrawing protection implies vulnerability, and implying vulnerability means admitting that Ukraine's campaign is working. So Russia keeps replacing the systems Ukraine destroys, not because it's the strategically optimal thing to do, but because it's the politically necessary thing to do. And that is precisely the trap that Ukraine has set. Every air defense system Russia sends to Crimea is a system that is not defending somewhere else. The peninsula is draining Russian resources and Russian attention at a moment when Russia can afford neither. And there is another layer to this resource drain that deserves attention. Crimea has always required enormous investment to maintain even under peacetime conditions. Fresh water, for instance, was historically supplied by the North Crimean Canal from mainland Ukraine. Ukraine cut that water supply after 2014, forcing Russia to spend billions on alternative water infrastructure, desalination, reservoir development, piped water from the Kerch region. Russia spent heavily on this because politically they had no choice. They had to make Crimea work, because a failing Crimea was a failing Putin. Now that investment is under pressure from a completely different direction. Ukraine is not just targeting military assets. It is targeting the economic and logistical viability of Russian control itself. Every ruble Russia spends shoring up Crimea's civilian infrastructure is a ruble not spent on shells, not spent on drones, not spent on the wages of soldiers at the front. This is what a sophisticated modern siege looks like. It does not have to involve soldiers charging walls. It involves making the cost of occupation so high, so relentless, so inescapable, that the occupier eventually calculates that the price is too steep to keep paying. Meanwhile, the people of Crimea, both permanent residents and the tourists who came not knowing what they were walking into, are now experiencing something that will not leave them quickly. If you have ever been stuck somewhere, truly stuck, no gas, no clear timeline, no honest information from authorities about when things will improve, you know that it rewires something in how you think about your government's competence and your own safety. These Russian tourists will go home eventually. And when they do, they will carry with them a memory that no amount of state media can overwrite, because they lived it. They smelled the smoke. They waited in the lines. They saw the shelves. That is the picture Ukraine is painting, and the canvas is Russian lived experience. This is why I keep coming back to this story, and it's why I'm going to keep covering it even when other things are dominating the news cycle. What is happening in Crimea right now is not a footnote to this war. It is potentially the central chapter of how this war ends. Not in a single dramatic breakthrough, not in a massive offensive that recaptures everything in a month, but in the slow, grinding, strategically sophisticated degradation of Russia's ability to hold what it took. Ukraine does not need to storm Crimea if Crimea becomes ungovernable and unsustainable on its own. They do not need to fight their way across the Kerch Bridge if the bridge becomes irrelevant, because there is nothing left on the other side worth protecting. And crucially, this matters beyond just the military outcome. The political conditions inside Russia are being shaped by what happens in Crimea in ways that no battlefield victory or defeat in eastern Ukraine could ever fully replicate. When an ordinary Russian family drives back from a failed vacation in Crimea, burned-out trucks on the roadside, drones overhead, empty gas stations, packed roads with no clear end in sight, they are not just having a bad holiday. They are having a political awakening. Slowly, reluctantly, often angrily, they are reconciling the version of reality their government has been selling them with the version of reality that is burning their eyebrows off. And that reconciliation, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of travelers, across social media posts that even Russian censorship cannot fully contain, across phone calls and dinner conversations when people get home, is a force that no single military operation can replicate. Ukraine has found a way to make the war real to Russian civilians without ever firing a shot at Russian civilians. That is an extraordinary strategic achievement, and it is one that almost nobody in Western commentary gave Ukraine credit for pursuing until it was already well advanced. I have been saying for a long time that the recovery of Crimea was not the longest of long shots that people assumed it was. The path was always there. It was just slower and more patient than people wanted it to be. Right now, that path is more visible than it has ever been. The Ukrainian defense minister saying Crimea will soon become an island is not bravado. It is a description of a process that is already well underway. The Crimean Tatar leader telling settlers to leave while they still can is not a bluff. It is a warning from someone who understands the trajectory of events on the ground better than almost anyone. Russia is facing an existential question in Crimea right now, and the answer they give, or fail to give, will define the next phase of this war. Pay attention to this. The situation is shifting faster than most people realize, and the people inside Crimea, Russian and Ukrainian alike, are living through something that history is going to spend a long time trying to understand. If you've made it this far and you're not subscribed yet, now is genuinely the time. This channel is going to keep tracking every development in Crimea as it unfolds, and the next few weeks could be the most consequential of the entire conflict. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And share this video, because the more people who understand what's actually happening here, the harder it is for the Russian information machine to bury it. I'll see you in the next one.